I wrote the first draft of The Thunder Heist in 42 days. And the really crazy thing about this is that the very first book I wrote took me 360 days to write the first draft. So what was it that let me write The Thunder Heist 7 times faster while also writing it to a much higher quality? Because my first book was never published, but The Thunder Heist was. And it's had some lovely reviews from readers over the years, currently averaging 4.2 out of 5 stars on Amazon. Well, today I'm going to explain the 5 factors that helped me write my first draft so quickly so that you can speed up the time it takes to bring your own novels to life. And in case you're wondering, no, my secret wasn't that I spent 10 hours a day writing this thing. In fact, I averaged 104 minutes of writing per day when I was working on the first draft. And I did this when I was working at my day job before I became a full-time author. So no matter what situation you're in, I guarantee that you will be able to use these tactics I'm about to share with you to massively accelerate your own progress as a writer. So let's start with factor number 1, the trope brainstorm. Before I started writing The Thunder Heist, I'd just come off a novel project that had got me feeling a little bit burnt out, quite frankly. And a lot of that is because I felt like I was forcing myself to write about topics and ideas. The story I was exploring was something that maybe wasn't something I was super passionate about. And so I was kind of forcing myself to write this thing that I thought would be good, but it wasn't coming from a place of joy. After I finished that project, I told myself, look, whatever you write next, it just has to be something that's really fun for you. It can't be something that's a slog. It has to be really enjoyable from start to finish. So what I did is I got my notebook out and I put a little question in the middle of my page that said, what are the tropes or, what are the common story ideas or concepts that you just find utterly intoxicating to write about? What are the different tropes that every time you see them as a reader, you just light up and you would be so excited to explore them for yourself? And so here is that trope brainstorm that I did. And you can see here some of the things I've written down is I really like stories where redemption is a core idea. I like stories that are fast-paced thrill rides. I like characters who dislike each other, who are forced to work together. And I really like mainly urban settings because it lets me go deep into my love of architecture. And there's a couple of other elements you can see I brainstormed down as well. And so shortly after writing this initial brainstorm, I started outlining the Thunder Heist. And I really was able to incorporate a lot of these elements that I find super fascinating to explore into the book itself. And it's one of the big reasons, in fact, I would probably say it is the biggest reason why the first draft was so quick to write. Because the greatest productivity hack that you can do as a writer is to be writing about stuff that just utterly fascinates you. It's going to make the writing process feel like such a joy. It's going to feel so effortless. It's going to feel so much easier. By comparison, if you're trying to force yourself to write something that you think is going to be marketable or appealing to a certain group of readers, or it's going to be easy to publish, that is a bit dangerous. There is a time and place for thinking about how the market might respond to your story ideas, but if you are just trying to optimize for the most fun and the most speed when it comes to actually writing the first draft of your story, I highly recommend that you sit down and you take some time to map out all of the tropes that excite you the most when it comes to writing. And like I said, if you read The Thunder Heist, you can pretty much see a very direct link to a lot of these things I put down in this brainstorm into the final book. The Thunder Heist is an ocean punk fantasy novel that follows a roguish pirate who is attempting to steal a powerful device from a city that floats on a monster-infested sea. So you can see how all of these elements from the trope brainstorm really work their way into the final book. Now, before we get into the second factor that helped me write The Thunder Heist so quickly, I just want to have a quick side discussion about the idea of quality versus speed. Because you might be thinking, hey, there's no way this book can possibly be good because he wrote it so quickly. And again, like everyone's mileage may vary. You might read the book, you might hate it, you might read the book, you might love it, whatever. The point being is that I really want you to dissociate the idea of quality with being something that can only happen from spending a really long time on a project. Yes, obviously the longer you spend on a book, the more layers you can work into it, the more you can develop it and edit it and refine it. I'm not disagreeing with that at all. But there is also a time and a place for the book that comes out of you in just this burst of creative energy. Because in a lot of ways, that thing that comes out of you so quickly feels so natural to you because you're just writing about stuff that you were kind of born to write about, And again, this is the whole idea with the trope brainstorm. It's what are the things that I find myself just utterly fascinated by, the things that are just second nature for me to explore. When you're writing about stuff like that, you'll be surprised by how quickly a story can actually flow out of you. And there's actually a lot of historical examples about authors producing some of their most iconic work in the shortest amount of time possible. So for instance, Arthur Conan Doyle wrote A Study in Scarlet, which is the very first Sherlock Holmes novel, He wrote that in just 3 weeks while he was working at a medical practice, and he was 27 at the time as well, which is crazy. That's the first time that Sherlock Holmes appeared in a story, and his whole career kind of sprung forth from that 3-week period of writing a novel. John Boyne wrote The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, one of the most provocative stories about World War II and the Holocaust, in just 2.5 days, barely stopping to eat or sleep. And in interviews, he said this was completely unlike other novels, which usually took him a couple of months to write. Robert Louis Stevenson wrote the first draft of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 3 days while he was ill with tuberculosis. Although his wife critiqued it so harshly that he later burned the first draft and then rewrote the entire thing from scratch in another 3 days. So my point is, there are plenty of examples of authors producing great works of fiction in really tight timeframes. So you don't necessarily have to spend like 10 years laboring on a novel for it to be good. And personally, I actually find that quite liberating, because often I find that like the faster I'm writing, the higher quality my work is, because I'm less inhibited. I'm less, in my own head thinking about whether this is going to be good or not. Okay, the second factor that allowed me to write the first draft of The Thunder Heist in 42 days was outlining. If you've been on this channel for any stretch of time, you know that I'm a massive fan of outlining, and I think that it is essential in my mind to writing a story quick while also ensuring that it is of a high quality. So you can see here on my screen, this is a bit of my outline for The Thunder Heist. Back then I was calling it The Lightning Heist. I changed the title later on. I spent 5 days outlining this story, and then I started writing the first draft the next day. You can see here, I've basically broken it down into what's the chapter number, what's the title of the chapter, and then what's the main events that happen in this chapter. So I've got hook, conflict, climax. I've kind of evolved a little bit since then in terms of how I think about scene design and scene structure. But to read out the first chapter here, the hook is that our main character, Kef, is in jail. The conflict is that she's about to be executed. And then the climax of this chapter is we reveal that she actually entered the jail to extract a target, this architect figure who she is wanting to use in order to pull off the heist that's going to happen later in the story. And then we can see here, Kef escapes onto a boat by using, redacted, I won't spoil that, a crane and a riot. And then I've got a few other notes about what happens in this chapter. So have them read Kef's crimes before they execute her in order to characterize her so that we understand a bit of her backstory, show her being really snarky, and then show the wardens of the prison who are later going to hunt her. And so you can see it's only a couple of sentences for each chapter, but by having this outline, it just gave me that ability to know exactly how my story was going to unfold from start to finish. And particularly when writing a high story, which is what this book is, it's really important that you have certain elements that you're setting up, because then there's kind of a big twist about how they are all revealed and resolved together in the climax of the story. And that can be very hard to do if you're just trying to make it up as you go along. So I talk about outlining in way more detail in my book, Plotting Your Fantasy Novel. So if you want to learn about the outlining methods that I've developed over the 14 years of writing I've had, and after working with hundreds of students in my different writing programs and classes, definitely check the book out. It's been getting some lovely reviews from the readers who've gone through it already, and it just goes into way more detail than I can in these YouTube videos in terms of how you actually plot your story from start to finish, how you fill in the missing gaps in your story, how you cohesively integrate your character arcs with your plot, and a ton of other topics like that as well. Okay, the third factor that allowed me to write The Thunder Heist so quickly was keeping the story to a tight scope and a small scale. The Thunder Heist is one point of view character, apart from some little tricks that I pull off towards maybe the last third of the book. But for the most part, it's one point of view character. It's in one main setting, which is Zoreth, the floating city ship that is on this monster-infested sea that's made from all these boats that are lashed together. It's very alchemical, it's very sort of steampunky in nature. And it has a very small cast of important characters. We obviously have Kef, who is our protagonist, the pirate who is recruiting the other members of her thieving crew in order to steal this powerful device. And then outside of the thieving crew, we have a few major figures and players in Zoreth, and then a couple of background characters as well. But for the most part, the cast is pretty tight. There's not a ton of characters that you need to introduce and develop and take through arcs of their own. And so essentially, all of these different factors, the single point of view, the one main setting, a small cast of characters, they allowed me to keep the story quite focused and tight in terms of its scale and its scope. And that is really useful, I have found, in terms of speeding up the time it takes to actually write a story. Because the more moving pieces you add into your book in terms of more point of view characters, more side characters, more settings you need to establish and immerse the reader in, and more complexity in terms of your plot, these factors are going to make the writing process more difficult. Not always, but generally as a rule of thumb, it's going to increase the degree of difficulty you face. And I know that because I've written other books where I have had a much bigger scope and a much bigger scale to them, and they have taken me a lot longer to bring to life. It doesn't necessarily mean that those books are worse or better, because you can have a great story with a really tight scope, and you can have a great story with a really massive scope as well. All I'm saying is that if you're in the stages right now where you are kind of planning and developing your story, and it is your first project, I do generally encourage writers to keep that to a tight scope if they can, just because it's going to make it a lot easier for you. There's already a lot of difficulty and a lot of complexity when it comes to bringing any kind of novel to life. So if you can find ways to simplify things when you're in the outlining process, it's going to make your job a lot easier when you're actually writing the thing. The fourth factor that allowed me to write this book so quickly was cutting out the boring parts and moving the story at a fast pace. My approach when writing this book was very much informed by the project that came before it, which again was a bit of a slog. And when I was reflecting on it, part of that was because I did have sections that were quite slow paced, where there wasn't a ton of conflict, where my main character was just sort of wandering around. And I felt that I needed to have those scenes in order to show the passage of time and to show progression. And so what it meant is that I sometimes had these parts of my book that just weren't particularly engaging for me to write and were kind of boring me, and would probably bore readers as well. So with the Thunder Heist, I was really determined to just cut out any boring stuff and to move the story at quite a fast pace in terms of, things are progressing really quickly in the book. We're not having a ton of downtime. There's not just a lot of navel gazing where the characters are standing around and nothing's happening. Ideally, every single chapter is moving us closer towards the climax and the story's final objective of whether Kef can pull off this heist or not. And ideally, you're seeing meaningful movement towards that so that we're not having chapters that feel like they are filler. And so much of good writing, in my opinion, just comes down to this idea, which is, just cutting out the boring parts of your story. If your characters are traveling from location A to location B, you don't necessarily need to show every single minute of that journey. You can just cut past it. And I think taking that approach in the Thunder Heist, it really meant that I was very excited and energized to show up to writing each day, because there was never really a time where there was a scene or there was a chapter in front of me that I just had to write to get to more interesting stuff. I was having interesting stuff happen in each chapter, and I wasn't wasting any time or mental energy writing, boring filler material. Again, this is where outlining is so valuable, because you're able to look at your outline and you can go, you know what? Chapter 22 and chapter 23, I can probably cut those. I can just have, a brief mention of what happened in those chapters, and I don't actually have to show this logistical setup that's going on here. And then the fifth factor that helped me write this story so quickly was using my writing tracker spreadsheet and also building a solid routine around my writing. So up here on my screen, you can see the writing tracker spreadsheet that I use. I've been using this since 2018, and basically the way it operates is you've got the date on the side here, you've got the project that I'm working on, and then for each writing session that I have throughout a day, and I might have one writing session, I might have 4 writing sessions, I might have 2 writing sessions, I put down how many words I wrote, how many minutes I spent writing, and then basically at the end of each day, it gives me a total of here's how many words you wrote, here's your total time, here's your words per hour, and then if I've written for that day, which I obviously have here, it gives me this nice green box at the end. And this writing tracker spreadsheet, oh my God, like if you don't already have this set up for your writing, you need to get onto this, honestly, because it is probably like the single best habit that I have found over the 14 years I've been writing for making me be more productive and forcing me to show up each day, because it just gamifies the process of writing in a really powerful way. Once you start to see a few of these, these green writing days fill into your spreadsheet here, you just don't want to break the chain, right? I know one of the members who joined my Fantasy Writers Guild, which is my community for fantasy writers, Daniel Warren, he put this post into the community right after he joined up, where he was saying that he wrote 25,000 words in the first week of being inside the guild. And keep in mind, before he came into the guild, he had been writing, a few thousand words per week. And the reason that he credited this to was because everyone who joins the guild gets my writing tracker spreadsheet. And all of a sudden, he just found himself having this insane motivation to try and cross over 10,000 words in a week, 15,000 words in a week, and so on. So I bring that up to say, if you don't have a writing tracker spreadsheet already, you need to get onto this. All of the writers I've given it to have said that it has been transformative for their productivity. So basically walking you through this writing tracker spreadsheet so you can see the full timeline of how this looked in terms of writing this story, I basically started outlining it on the 4th of March. I spent 5 days outlining it. I wish I had actually tracked how much time I spent outlining it here, but I didn't. Then I started writing the first draft the next day. And you can see here, the first 2 days, I was really easing myself into it. 208 words the first day in 25 minutes, which, almost sounds like nothing. But then the next day, 750 words. And then days 3 and 4 did 8,000 words over those 2 days. It just really clicked into gear and I was able to go, make substantial progress with the story. The thing I really want to point out here, and the thing that hopefully you see as quite an encouraging sign here, is that there are some days here in this spreadsheet where you can see I barely did any writing at all, right? So there's one day here where I wrote 57 words in the course of 3 minutes. And I can just about guarantee this was a day that I was probably super busy with work or life stuff or whatever. And I just thought, oh man, I'm not going to have any time to write today. But I just found a way to squeeze in 3 minutes of just opening up the document and just putting a couple of sentences into the story. Even if those sentences were crap, even if I deleted them the next day, it's so essential. And to me, I think this is one of the biggest takeaways that I want you to get from this video. To me, I think it is so essential if you can try and write your story every single day, even if it is literally like 3 sentences, even if it's literally like 3 words. Because when you work on your story every single day, it just does something to your brain where it kind of lodges it into this place in your subconscious so that when you're not working on the book and you're having a shower or you're at work or you're going for a walk or you're grocery shopping or whatever it is, your brain is sort of ticking over the story in the back of your mind. And because you're working on it every single day, it sort of lodges it in there. And it means that when you show up to write the next morning or the next evening or whenever it is, you will be often quite surprised by how these problems with the story that you were sort of thinking about have just resolved themselves. And I find that maintaining that momentum is so powerful. It's a lot easier for me to maintain the momentum of working on a story every single day rather than maybe working on it 2 or 3 days in a week and then having 4 days without it and then coming back to it and kind of trying to remind myself of the character's voice and where we're at and all of those sort of things. So to walk you through the rest of this writing tracker spreadsheet, just so you can see how this project evolved from start to finish, I finished the first draft on the 19th of April. So yeah, like I said before, 42 days. Then you can see this big blank section in my spreadsheet here. I think this might have been when I was starting to look at writing an interactive fiction novel for Choice of Games. So I was kind of doing research into that and probably, coming up with initial concepts. Then I started editing the story on the 16th of May and finished the second draft about 40 days later here as well. You can see I was definitely spending a lot less time on it per day when I was in this editing phase. I was also, again, working on my pitch for Siege of Trebelin as well. So some of these days are kind of blended and split between those 2 projects. And then as we continue on with this writing tracker spreadsheet, you can see I started outlining the sequel to the Thunder Heist, which I will get around to finishing at some point. I know a lot of you have emailed me about this. I have like 20,000 words of it written, so I do need to finish this at some point. But you can see the rest of the year was sort of split between like outlining the Siege of Trebelin, editing the Thunder Heist, working on the sequel to the Thunder Heist a little bit, and then eventually getting into like the production side of things for the Thunder Heist as well. Because I self-published this book, so, I needed to do the cover design, needed to have an editor look at it, format it, all of those sort of things. And then after all that work, we published the book on the 19th of October, 2020. So altogether, it was 229 days from when I started outlining this book to when it was actually published. And again, like that's not me working on this book every single day. There were other projects I was working on in that time frame as well. But generally speaking, I would say that's a pretty quick turnaround to go from starting a book to having it published within 3/4 of a year. So I was really happy with how that progression went. So if you want to read the Thunder Heist for yourself and see how I actually did with the story, because like I said, you might love it, you might hate it. Only way to really know is to read it yourself. I'll link to the book down in the description below, or you can just search for the Thunder Heist on any bookstore of your choice. And if you want to improve your writing even further, then you might want to check out this video over here. Keep writing and keep striving, and I'll see you in the next video.